Hello, hi, welcome to episode 53 of Stand Up. Thank you very much for downloading and subscribing and giving a rating to this podcast. It's hard to make it for a brother in the world of podcasts, but all of you listening and supporting, I cannot thank you enough. Really appreciate it. It is not easy. I especially appreciate those of you that are subscribing on Patreon with a paid subscription. That is huge. Go to PeteDominic.com or check the link in the show notes here or patreon.com/PeteDominic. Thank you. Like 10 new subscribers in the last 2 days alone. I just am so overwhelmed with your support, and it is really motivating, making me work really hard. So hard that, in fact, today's show, I've got 4 guests. Yeah, that's right. Today's show is a mixed bag of really interesting and brilliant experts in their fields. That's most of what you get here on Stand Up. Some episodes, most are one long, uninterrupted talk, while others are several shorter conversations. Which type do you like the most? Or do you like the variety I'm bringing and slinging, hosting and posting 3 days a week? Let me know. First, today we talk coronavirus with Dr. Meghan May, who is an expert on infectious disease, vaccines, and emerging diseases. Scary stuff happening there. You want to know as much as you can. We had a great conversation. Then I'll turn to national security, what we know about Russian efforts to interfere in our this current election with former Army and FBI Special Agent Clint Watts. Then my third guest is a professor of religious history, Mikki of Washington and Lee University. We'll discuss her viral tweets supporting Elizabeth Warren. We also chat Harvey Weinstein and the history of the phrase witch hunt. And finally, I welcome a fourth guest who is a businessman and investor named Roger McNamee to talk about his book, Zucked, about Facebook and its influence. Again, before we get started, thank you to all the Patreon supporters. I couldn't do, and I wouldn't do this show without your paid subscriptions. And keep it coming. So tell your friends. I really appreciate it. Also, thank you for your support on social media. It has been a hard last 4 months for me. And this week we found out that my daughter's scoliosis has progressed in the wrong direction, and she's going to have to wear a back brace. And I talked about that on social media, and so many people came out and supported me. And it's been amazing. That's not a life or death issue, but it's a serious issue. It's going to be a lot of adversity for her. And we've just learned this. So if you or someone you know has dealt with scoliosis, please reach out to me and tell me how you dealt with it. Email me, standuppete@gmail.com. All right, let's get to Dr. Meghan May of New England University. She is an expert when it comes to these emerging diseases and viruses and vaccines. And she's been kind enough to join me a number of times here. I think this is like her third conversation with me here on the podcast. She's on Twitter @drmay5. And like I said, New England University. Please follow her there. Here's my conversation answering all your questions about coronavirus with Dr. Meghan May right now on Stand Up.
Yeah, it's been a really busy 36 hours, and I don't know. It's been crazy.
What has changed in the last 36 hours? And I'm recording now.
Okay. Well, the past 36 hours have had a lot of developments on totally different fronts. We've started to see some actual responses and plans-ish type things from the administration. That's been interesting to watch and kind of analyze. We've gotten really surprising numbers out of Italy and out of Iran that are stunning for different reasons and concerning for different reasons.
Italy and Iran, the administration's response. What about China?
So China, this has been very, very odd in that the headlines for maybe the past 4 or 5 days are the case numbers in China are coming down, and that's great news. And maybe this is starting to kind of cycle itself out. But the problem with that is that you have to look at that in context, in that China has defined and then redefined again what they're actually calling a case. So at first, they were defining anybody who either tested positive for the virus or had clinical symptoms that were consistent with it, so kind of a fever, pneumonia, cough, etc., they were all put into the case total. After that, what they did was they changed the definition to have just a patient who had a positive test plus clinical signs. So not either or, but they had to have both things. The reason that matters is that there were a lot of patients who were testing positive but didn't have full-blown pneumonia or any signs at all or any symptoms at all, and they were suddenly taken out of the case total. So the number got lower, but it wasn't exactly as though, thousands of people were suddenly not infected anymore. It's just that they weren't counted in the total anymore. After that, when a bunch of people said,
yeah, go ahead.
That's kind of problematic because if those people can still transmit virus, we need to know about them. Then the definition became anyone who had the respiratory disease, regardless of positive test or not. And that was an entirely different number. And so it got to a situation where what China was reporting almost from one day to the next was slightly different. And so if you look at their trends and numbers, it's really hard to glean any kind of meaning out of that, because it's sort of depends on the moment what group of people you're actually talking about. And then different countries are saying, only people with, positive tests are going to be counted in our total. So,
all right. So let me just understand how the kind of organization and infrastructure works. You've got the World Health Organization, and we can talk about, what their responsibility is. But every country has their own disease prevention, and abilities to attack any of the issues that they're facing, health issues that they're facing. Obviously, some countries are better prepared, better resourced, and some are not. And that becomes what we're looking at, right? How much do you look at the fact that certain countries are more prepared, have different styles of government? And then, of course, the real issue seems to be once this, and now it seems inevitable, spreads this virus to underdeveloped nations, then you've got a real problem because they don't have the resources and infrastructure to respond. Is that what I'm reading, learning?
This is absolutely correct. And so you have really two different problems entirely, in that you have a country like China who is perfectly resourced to handle an outbreak like this, but their reporting and sharing of information is not as transparent or consistent as the rest of us might appreciate. On the other hand, you have countries like, you have several countries, say in sub-Saharan Africa, that would be perfectly transparent with their case numbers, but perhaps don't have the resources and infrastructure to routinely test everybody who presents who might be sick. And so those are two entirely different sets of problems, but either way, you have infected people that you may not be counting, and you may not be able to then trace and follow and figure out their epidemic spread. That being said, I do have to say from the standpoint of, say, African countries, it wasn't until about a week or so ago that there were multiple countries on the entire continent that had the reagents and the labs and the capacity in place to actually do routine testing, but now several do, which is terrific. But that was a concern for a long time, the idea of, well, there haven't been any cases in Africa. And then the question was, have there not been any, or do we just not know about them?
Right.
So we're catching up, but we're almost dealing with two entirely different sets of problems.
What are we calling it now? Coronavirus is a type of virus, but this is specifically known as COVID-19. What do you call it in the business of I can't say the word. Immunology? Immunology? You say it. So
immunology.
Hard. Never struggled so much with any word.
But in this case, we're usually, in our business that's relevant here, we would be emerging diseases. So it actually has two official names, which I know is not helpful to anyone, but it is what it is. COVID-19 that you mentioned, so that's the name of the disease. The name of the virus itself is SARS-CoV-2. SARS-2, return of SARS, but not really. So the way that you could think about this would be something to the effect of measles is a disease. The virus that causes measles is called rubeola virus. So same idea, COVID-19 disease, SARS-CoV-2 virus.
What I've read is that this disease seems to have a fatality rate of less than 2%, which is a lot lower than most outbreaks that make this type of news and get this much attention, but that this virus has caused a lot of concern, not because of its low fatality rate, rather despite the low fatality rate, but because of it. Is that why? Is that the deal? I read that wrong.
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons why this became of interest, and the low fatality rate relatively is reassuring, but it's not something to be complacent about either. So one reason why it started getting so much attention was that we weren't sure for a long while what the fatality rate was because of that lack of information that was coming out. So the thought was, if this is so close and so reminiscent to SARS and to MERS, its cousins, who are also coronaviruses, we might be looking at 10 to 30%, respectively, for those two viruses. And so if this one was going to be anywhere in that neighborhood, the number of cases that were coming out and the rate at which the case total was kind of piling up, that was starting to look catastrophic. So that being said, now that we have a little bit more information and a little bit better handle on, 2% does seem about right. We can look at that and say, all right, that's promising. 2%, that's not bad, that's nothing. But when you start thinking about how many people there are in the world and how many cases there are likely to be, 2% of millions of people is a lot of people, So
all right, well, let me ask you.
And then the other piece to this too is seasonal flu has a case fatality rate of less than 1%, but we still see thousands of people die every year. And we have to remember, in that context, this is something thousands of people die of every year in this country with a much lower case fatality rate, and we have medications that can treat it. And we really don't have anything here. So 2% is low, but it's still
a lot of
dead people.
True or false? The likely outcome of this is that ultimately it will not be containable. Is that what you think? It's not looking good, honestly. It really isn't. Where we are in the U.S. and frankly in the Western Hemisphere right now, we haven't had too much trouble on this side of the world, which is promising, but that can change pretty quickly. And when I look especially at the case numbers that just came out of Italy, all of a sudden, within just a few days, they've got over 300 cases, and they had very, very few before that. And if you think about the European Union and how transit in the European Union works, the idea of, if you have any EU passport, you just get on the highway or get on the train and you can go to any other country. And if you think about how we've been doing contact tracing, and we've been telling people in the US, okay, don't travel to this part of China, or don't travel to China at all. Or if you've been there, you monitor yourself for X number of days. If you think about transit within the European Union, now you've suddenly got all these countries where people are transiting between borders without checking in anywhere. It's just, it just became exponentially more complicated
to do.
Another sentence to prevent it. Another sentence I read was the emerging consensus among epidemiologists is that the most likely outcome of this outbreak is a new seasonal disease, a fifth, quote, endemic coronavirus. We've got the flu, we've got others, and this would just be a part of life. Is that something that you agree with?
I think that is entirely plausible. The one thing that we don't know is how well this is going to kind of overwinter. So think about flu again. We very rarely see flu in the U.S. And in the Northern Hemisphere as a whole. We very rarely see flu cases in, say, July. And then, just like always, they pop back up again in October, November, and then they disappear again by April or May. So there's a seasonality to it that we understand. We don't understand this at all. We have no idea what it's going to do. So once we have people that are not in such close contact to each other over winter months, is it going to disappear to a level where it can't sustain itself through human-to-human transmission anymore? We have no idea. So on the one hand, I could very easily see that. It wouldn't shock me if that happened. On the other hand, I don't think we know. We have no year-to-year comparisons to make.
All right, let's talk about the United States preparedness and the statements that we're hearing coming out of the administration as well as the
I feel good. Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah. The CDC apparently today said Americans should brace for the likelihood that the coronavirus will spread to communities in the United States. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention said this on Tuesday. It's not so much a question of if this will happen in this country anymore, but a question of when this will happen, said the director of the National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Diseases, Nancy Messonnier. Do you know who she is, Dr. Nancy Messonnier?
I do know who she is. It's beyond a doubt that there will be more cases in this country. Absolutely. As to whether we can or should leave this at a level of it's going to be here. We're going to have massive human-to-human transmission. So we just throw our hands up and say, screw it. I don't know that that's the approach that most of us think is most useful.
Is that are you insinuating that is the approach? Are you insinuating the administration or the CDC right now is not being responsible?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult to say, right? Because the actual plans for how allocations of funds are going to be used and what types of measures are going to be put in place, what types of resources there'll be for contact tracing. So, which is a term meaning, if you have a patient who is a positive tested case, the people who follow up with them and then interview and monitor all of their people they've been in contact with, that takes resources, that takes personnel, that takes testing capacity. And has that been budgeted for? We know there as of now has finally been an appropriation request to Congress for additional monies to support this, but we don't know what those are going to go to. And so that type of information is information that we would need to be able to say, yep, we are prepared, we're going to be fine, versus, no, I think we really need to put our heads down and just accept that this is just going to be here. I think right now there are no active infections in the United States. That could change tomorrow. That could change this afternoon. But as of now, there are not. And so to say this is going to happen and we're going to have sustained human-to-human transmission, maybe, but maybe we don't need to have that happen if we're properly prepared and resourced. I don't know. It felt a little bit defeatist to me. And so being honest with the public, to me means saying somewhere between it's not a matter of if, but when we will have human-to-human transmission sustained, and it's going to be seasonal every year and it's just with us now. And what the president said last night, which was everything's under control and fine, everything's fine, no need to worry about this. To me, the reality is somewhere in between those two things, which is, as of right now, here are the steps we're taking. Here's what we will do when we see an active case. And if all those measures are followed, then we should be able to keep these as small, isolated events. It's just, it's very odd to me that seems to be the reality, right? That if we're properly resourced, perhaps we can, keep these as local contained cases. If we're not, then, perhaps we do need to accept the inevitable. So,
well, that's and if that's the way that you're framing it, I appreciate that opinion a lot more than most people who don't have experience on this. Now, let me just ask you one more question about kind of prevention and vaccination. I've been reading a lot about the way that vaccines are developed and the effectiveness of them and how it's very difficult with these viruses because they evolve. But what, best case scenario is like a year or a year and a half before a product could be deemed safe and effective that could be deployed to help prevent this disease. What would you say about that?
So it's funny. I was at the exact right place a week and a half ago to be able to provide insight about this. I was at the Zika and Aedes associated infection disease meeting, and because this emerging disease outbreak happened, just 6 weeks before this meeting was set to occur, we put together an emergency lunchtime session to talk about coronavirus. And one of the presenters was a scientist from the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease. So the guy that you see, Anthony Fauci, who's on the news all the time, that he's the director of this, right? So this woman worked for him. And one of the things that they work on kind of as a day-to-day thing when we're not all, chasing some new crazy virus is they were working on platforms and systems to rapidly develop new vaccines that could be that could kind of serve as a template where you could plug in a brand new pathogen and then have this backbone and this kind of speedy way to mass produce a vaccine very quickly. And they happened to use SARS and MERS coronaviruses as the template for how they were going to do this. And so this new thing that came along happens to be a very close cousin. And it was almost unbelievably perfect timing in that they had this template and this more or less this mold already to just pop in this new virus and have essentially a synthetic vaccine that's ready to go. So Fauci was being interviewed, I think just today on MSNBC, and he was saying that, within a few weeks, we're going to start phase 1 safety trials for a new vaccine for this.
Oh, wow.
And it sounds almost unbelievable, right? That, well, how can you possibly have a vaccine already when you, when you just discovered this thing, in the numbers of weeks ago? And it just happened to be this perfect turn of circumstance that they had the exact mold already made, but it was, it wasn't anything conspiratorial. It was more or less just that they developed it using SARS, and this new guy happens to be a close relative. So,
well, you mentioned that's good news. You mentioned conspiracy, and I don't know if you heard about what Rush Limbaugh was saying. The Chinese, I guess, sent this virus here to hurt Trump and the economy or something.
Yeah.
But I know that you've talked about conspiracy and vaccines a little in the past. Here at the end of our conversation, because I'd take up 10 more hours of your time, but you have a life and a job, and I appreciate your time. So how do you look at or convince people that might be on the edge jour, crossed the line into conspiracy town about vaccines, their development, their effectiveness, and, insidious actors, ghosts.
Well, it's funny you ask that. So I'm in Maine, and we have a referendum question attached to our Super Tuesday primary on this very subject. So it's something that's come up a lot lately, but it's almost, there are almost two different sets of conspiracies here to deal with. One is the idea of anything to do with vaccines. There's always, the tinfoil hats come out and people are like, how could it be? It's so convenient that they just happen to have this ready to go. And so then the temptation is to think like, oh, is this entire thing for someone to make money because they had this vaccine kind of in the can and, whatever. But that, never mind, it's being made and developed at a U.S. government lab. So profit, not really part of the equation. Anyway, so there's the idea of vaccine conspiracies, which are always a popular favorite. And then there's also, with this virus in particular, there's a lot floating around about the idea of, was this released by a Chinese government lab? Is it a biological weapon? It's neither of those things are particularly credible. With regard to the biological weapon piece, a lot of people are making hay out of the idea that there's one of the virology research institutes in China that has a BSL-4 lab. So that's the highest biosafety level that, you need a laboratory like that to work with Ebola or Lassa fever or any of those scary guys.
There's a lab there that has that virus in it and it got out there and they're trying to hide it.
That's what the conspiracy is. And there is indeed a BSL-4 lab in Wuhan, but coronaviruses aren't BSL-3 agents, aren't BSL-4 agents. And so the location of that lab being near the center of the outbreak is sort of irrelevant. There was very early on that the thought was, well, they took part of the HIV genome and they put it into this new virus and it accidentally escaped. And it's sort of like, that's not a thing.
Wow.
That's, you can tell by looking at its genes. It has nothing to do with HIV. And so,
a lot of these things just sound like great screenplays. There's coincidences, and that's how
screenplays anyway. Yeah, exactly.
Maybe not, but it's just so easy for people to connect dots and say, well, this is here and this is there,
and so
and
obviously
that couldn't happen without this.
And it's
we need to all do better and ask harder questions and talk to people like you that can debunk that kind of stuff so easily. But people don't. People don't have. Rush Limbaugh's not talking to you on his show.
That's as much as I'm sure he would be delighted to make my acquaintance and vice versa. He's swung around quite a bit, and his first conspiracy was that it's released from a lab, it's a weapon, and then yesterday his conspiracy was that this coronavirus really just causes the common cold. And so really it's a media conspiracy because they're trying to make Trump look bad.
Listen, it's hard to do 3 hours of live radio every day. I know
sometimes
that. You got to have content.
You evolve
got to have a narrative.
Full circle within, 6 weeks. It's one of those, it was frustrating to see that, and actually did a big Twitter thread about it last night. Because there's like this little kernel of truth in it. And this is a great commonality with a lot of anti-vaccine material as well. And that there's this little teeny kernel of reality in there somewhere. And then this entire conspiracy gets wrapped around it. And so in this case with Limbaugh, there are coronaviruses that cause the sniffles, right? But saying coronavirus, it's from a taxonomy standpoint, it's a whole family of viruses. It's the same as saying the canine family. So, right, you have wolves, and you have jackals, and you have coyotes, and you have golden retrievers, and you have a whole bunch of stuff mixed in there. And so we know that the common cold, right? The sniffles, that's like a golden retriever, and MERS is like a giant timber wolf, and this new guy is, sort of like a jackal type thing, or a coyote. You wouldn't necessarily, it's not like taunting a timber wolf, but at the same time, you wouldn't necessarily want to pat it the way you would your Springer Spaniel.
I love the entire metaphor. That's helpful for me.
Hey, man, dogs are huge for biology metaphors. They're fabulous. Right? Yeah. So, like a diverse organism, there's nothing better than comparing it to a dog, because.
One more. Let me ask you one more question about a tweet that you had. Richard Blumenthal, senator from Connecticut, said this morning's classified coronavirus briefing should have been made fully open to the American people. They would be as appalled and astonished as I am by the inadequacy of preparedness and prevention. And then you quoted Senator Blumenthal's tweet saying, "I don't understand on any level why pandemic preparedness would be classified. The people who need to take measures are not in the room to advise nor to hear the latest information. My question to you, Dr. Meghan May, is what is the precedent for keeping this type of information, these types of outbreaks classified here in the United States, America?"
I don't know. Ask the guys who ran the Chernobyl response how well that went. The point being that if you're talking about pandemic preparedness, why in the world would that be classified information? It makes zero sense. And frankly, historically, the idea of what are we going to do to respond to a particular outbreak? You can have closed door meetings, you can have closed door task force, but something being classified information, I mean, we can derive a whole lot of meaning from that, right? That anyone able to access that information has to have security clearances, has to go through vetting. And why in the world would anything to do with outbreak preparedness meet that standard?
You want that to be open source so every scientist and doctor in the country has the same information.
So picture, if you were a nurse, or if you were a physician, or you were a med tech, and you worked in an ER, and somebody comes in and they have, lower respiratory tract infection. They're coughing on everything, which, it's February. That happens quite a bit. And in all likelihood, it's not going to be this new virus on this particular Tuesday in February, but tomorrow could be different. Why would you not want, as a doctor, nurse, med tech, whatever you are, why in the world should you not have the most recent information? You need that because you're the one who's on the front line, who's exposed and is at risk. And at the same time, you are also the ones who can provide the most up-to-date information about what types of patients you're seeing and what their travel patterns are and things like that. So it made absolutely no sense to me. And Blumenthal's point, obviously was quite different, that he was trying to say that this has not been particularly organized or well thought out. But I could not get past the word classified.
That's not normal? They don't normally classify this type of stuff in the past?
For a briefing to hear about how are you going to allocate funds for something that, we have had cases of here, I don't see on any level that should be normal.
What about the fact that Ken Cuccinelli has been appointed by President Trump as the head of the coronavirus commission he created? Ken Cuccinelli has no experience. He's this anti-immigrant guy, a former lieutenant governor, I think, of Virginia. Why? I mean, you would think you'd have a scientist or someone.
You would
else
think, and he's was on Fox News, so I guess there's that. But
that makes a difference.
That's where you find the best people. But yeah, no, it's not. To be fair and put it in context, it's not unusual to have some political appointees leading task force, because there is an element of needing to know how the system works and needing to know what levers need to be pushed, pulled to get money flowing, to get people flowing, all that kind of stuff. So I don't want to pretend that there's not, it's totally unprecedented to put a political appointee or a politician on these types of task forces. But I think we all saw from his Twitter snafus of the past day that that's not the situation we have here, right?
What did he do? I don't even know what I don't know what you're talking
this
about.
Is spectacular. So, the Hill has a really spectacular story about it. So basically, his first tweet about it, he was looking for the live map of where cases are that Johns Hopkins has been providing and updating, and he said, yesterday afternoon, has the Johns Hopkins map of the coronavirus stopped working for other people or just me? And then he put the link up. So this is on his Twitter page, to which, several people then clearly responded, please God, tell me that this is some kind of joke, that the task force head is not asking Twitter for information and help accessing it rather than the other way around.
Insane.
And it's absolutely insane. And then he follows it up with, I just tried again, and it looks like Johns Hopkins put the information behind a membership wall of some kind. Seems like bad timing to stop helping the world with this previously useful resource.
So he's trying to shame Johns Hopkins, but it's actually he doesn't know what he's doing?
Yes and no. The first being, yes, he doesn't know what he's doing. And then he's also, there's a little bit of maybe like, well, this isn't helpful of them. But first of all, this isn't helpful of Hopkins. But at the same time, what it seems like he's actually asking for is for somebody who is behind the membership wall, which again, that's not a thing. Really, the site was overloaded due to traffic because of so many people checking it, right? He was trying to get something that's behind a paywall sent to him via Twitter. And it's sort of like, you're not a grad student whose university doesn't have access to that journal. You're the head of the task force. Are you kidding me with this? Like, this is...
Get on the phone.
I mean, it's insane.
Oh boy! All right.
So there you go.
I appreciate everything. The having access to you and sharing this with everybody. You can't have enough information. But we'll keep in touch, and everybody should be following you. And I'll do all the plugs on the way out here again, Meghan.
Sounds
Thank you
good.
so much.
No, it's good to talk to you. Thanks for keeping talking about this.
Of course. We'll keep talking about it right here on this podcast, and we appreciate very much you joining us. Follow Meghan on Twitter, drmay5. Get more information from her. She's always tweeting about this. Thank you so much,
All right,
Meghan.
good to talk to you.
All right, that is Dr. Meghan May of New England University. Please check her out on Twitter. Give her a follow, drmay5. Add her on Twitter, Dr. Meghan May. On Facebook.com/Dr. Meghan May as well. Okay, now I have a new guest that I've never spoken to until yesterday when we talked early in the morning because she's over in the UK. Got up early to tape my conversation with Professor Mikki Brock because she wrote some tweets, a series just of 3 tweets after the Sunday Nevada caucuses. Was it Sunday over the weekend? Where Elizabeth Warren did not fare very well. And she just talked about how difficult it is to watch a woman work so hard and be so good and still not come in first. I'll have her read those tweets during this conversation, but really interesting, very smart woman who I was excited to get on the podcast for the first time. She's a professor of religion at Washington and Lee University, and she is also on Twitter at Mikki Brock. You should follow her there. Really good on Twitter. And we also talked about the fact that Harvey Weinstein is going to jail. She had written a piece about him and this idea of powerful men using the phrase witch hunt the wrong way in the Washington Post back in 2017. We talked about that as well. I think you're going to enjoy our conversation right now. And here we are. I've got Mikki Brock. She's in the UK. but we are talking, and I'm really excited because we met via Twitter. Mikki, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So the other night, I guess it was the day after the debate, you tweeted about Elizabeth Warren and how disappointed that you were that she wasn't doing better in the Democratic primary. And the tweet absolutely exploded. You've got a pretty good following for a university professor of history already, but to see this tweet explode, I want to talk about what it was and why. So before we read it, what was your view on the debate? What was the impetus for this tweet and Elizabeth Warren?
Yeah, so I actually sent it on Sunday morning UK time, and it was sort of in response to the results of the Nevada primaries coming in, and feeling a bit disappointed that Elizabeth Warren hadn't performed better there, although there was a bit of a sort of set of early voters who cast their votes before the debate performance, so may have been less impacted by the debate itself. But really, I think I was just reflecting in general on my sense, in the sense that a lot of my friends and colleagues have, that Elizabeth Warren is such a uniquely qualified candidate. She's enthusiastic, she's engaging, she has plans, all of the things that I think a lot of folks are really interested in a presidential candidate. And she's doing worse in some of the results and in some of the polling than a number of men on stage who I think seem sort of manifestly less qualified for the position of president of the United States and for Democratic nominee. And so I really was just reflecting on my own sort of personal feelings about Warren and the way that the country has reacted to her and some of the standards that she, and I should say a lot of other women, including Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton and others, have been held to in the public eye.
Yeah, well, obviously it resonated with a lot of people. It resonated with me. I think you just wrote it perfectly in a series of 3 tweets. Is it too hokey to ask you to read it?
No, I can read it.
Okay.
Sure. That Warren isn't doing better in the Democratic primary feels personal to me and to so many women in my life. We know what it is to be hyper-prepared, to have the plans, to do the necessary work and then some, to smile and try to be likable, to bring the energy and enthusiasm, to skate that absurdly thin line between passionate and not too emotional, angry and acceptable, relatable and professional, to do things as right as can be done and yet still be passed over and overlooked in favor of men. And this bar is even higher for women of color. Listen, I like Bernie. Some of his supporters, not so much. But would he be where he is? Messy hair, yelling, unwillingness to discuss personal life, etc., if he was a woman? I doubt it. Anyway, it's not over. But I just wanted to say that some of us are tired and a bit sad.
There it is in 3 tweets at Mikki Brock, Mikki Brock, and it has gotten very, very big, thousands and thousands of likes and retweets, and I wonder why you think that is. I think, if you don't mind, that you just perfectly captured what a lot of women are feeling, what a lot of men understand women are feeling. What do you think it was that in that series of 3 tweets was so popular to so many?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're hitting the nail on the head there. I think it resonated with a lot of people. I think it reflects a lot of conversations that people may have, been having with their own friends, with their daughters, their sisters, the women in their lives. And I think certainly, and this is, I think, really, really critical for a lot of Black women. They had this, and women across the board had this response when Kamala Harris dropped out. I think a lot of mediocre white dudes stayed in. And I think that's really critical to recognize that sort of Black women and women of color face, far more scrutiny than white women. I think that touched a nerve as well. And I think, frankly, 2016 kind of broke all of our brains. We're all a little bit panicked. There's this constant sort of din of fear that we're all grappling with. Even those of us like you and I who are in relative positions of privilege, we're fearful and sort of freaked out. And so I think as I was sorting through my own feelings on this and through the primary in general, I think so are a lot of other people who felt something or saw something of themselves in what I wrote.
Also 2016 seemed to, and I thought you were going to say, break a lot of us in that a man who was so horrible to so many women so publicly for so long was able to win. I remember the day after the election, it was the first day I ever felt discriminated against because as a white man, I just thought people were looking at me and saying, you voted for him. And I wanted to scream, it wasn't me. It wasn't me. But I mean, how much, you go from there to the Women's March, which I was attended and covered in Washington, D.C., which was an amazing energy, and the movement, the Me Too and Time's Up movement. We're going to talk about Harvey Weinstein in a moment. But to see Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris and other women not doing better as a result of all of these circumstances and developments, it's disappointing and surprising is how I would phrase it. What do you think in terms of the aggregate of all of these things? And most importantly, Donald Trump, a horrible, horrible misogynist and man winning over a woman.
Yeah. So, I have to say, so I will be honest, I supported Bernie Sanders in the 2016 primary, mostly because I am actually, pretty far to the left on the American political spectrum. But the moment Hillary got the nomination, I, was all in, doing everything I could, donating money and so forth. And she was, probably the most qualified presidential candidate in history and lost to Donald Trump, which was, really, I think, horrible and hard to see in so many respects. I mean, I really remember there was one debate that the two of them had during the general election where he was walking around the stage and sort of looming behind her in this kind of frightening way. And a lot of women I know were watching that and sort of almost feeling sort of physically fearful for her, the way that he was comporting himself. I think in 2016, so I think we did nominate a woman who did win by, I hasten to add, 3 million popular votes, right? But I think, the reaction now and the sort of, I think the election of Trump was a reaction against the election of the first Black president. I think that really, a lot of racism that was always there really boiled to the surface. And I think Hillary's loss has really freaked people out to think that, well, we can't take another risk and nominate someone who's not a white man. I mean, certainly the fact that Julian Castro and Cory Booker as well are no longer in the race, bringing those perspectives and experiences of people of color. I mean, that's, we had the most diverse Democratic field ever back in the fall, and look where we are now. And I think a lot of people are just sort of trying to wade through that. But no doubt the Democratic fear of nominating a woman or a person of color is a direct response to 2016 and to the fact that a lot of people were shocked by the victory of Trump, and probably foolishly shocked. We should have known that these undercurrents were there, but we missed it.
Yeah, all well said. Very thoughtful. Going back to your tweet, I want to try to, as painful as it is, play devil's advocate. Like, how do you prove to people that these sentiments, that this structure of inequity is real? This idea that you have to skate the ridiculously thin line between passionate and not too emotional, angry and not too, but acceptable, relatable and professional. Is there any like specific experiences? There might be people that hear you say that and be like, oh, it's not that bad. It's not that double standard. I mean, all of those people would be men, I suppose, some women, but how do you back that up for those that might not believe that that's the paradigm in the U.S. and probably most countries in the world?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's a ton of social science research on this, actually, about the way that women are treated in the public sphere versus men. And I think, we can look at the work of, Kate Mann, who's written a great book about the internal logic of misogyny. She's really great to follow on Twitter. There's a professor called Brittany Cooper who does a lot of really interesting work on the intersections.
I love Brittany.
Yeah, she's amazing,
awesome.
Between race and feminism. And so, there are loads of folks you can sort of follow on Twitter and a lot of social science research actually that you could read to have that borne out. But I think, more broadly, if you look at the representation of women in Fortune 500 companies, if you really just look at the fact that we haven't had a woman president, or we have the most diverse Congress we've ever had, and we're still looking at about 20% women. So, I think it's sort of borne out by the results. Now, I do think that I hope that this is shifting. I mean, a lot of women won in the 2018 midterms, and that was really heartening. I think a lot of us sort of saw that as particular progress. But certainly folks, if it's not your experience, you sort of question the validity of whether or not this inequity is true. But I think it's just manifestly evident in the results that we've gotten and in the research as well. And actually, as a very basic example, just go on between sort of, if we're thinking about intersectionality and the way that women of color in particular are treated, look at how the media treated someone like Kate Middleton versus Meghan Markle. Totally worlds different. So you can see these things fairly evidently.
Yeah, that's a great point. And what a great answer. I put you on the spot with that. But yeah, the social science, obviously, but and you mentioned two great sources there that everybody should look up. Professor Crunk is Brittany Cooper on
and I think it's
Twitter.
at Kate Mann is the handle for Kate Mann. I'm not positive.
Yeah, I'm going to try to get both of them on this podcast. All right, so I want to talk with you now about Harvey Weinstein, which happened this week. Harvey Weinstein was found guilty and is now sitting in Rikers Island. Back in 2017, you wrote a piece for the Washington Post titled, "No, there is no witch hunt against powerful men. They're the hunters, not the hunted." You are a professor of history at Washington and Lee University. You're on sabbatical right now over there in the UK, but you've been writing and teaching about the history of how do you explain exactly this history that very few people understand as well as you do?
Yeah, so as you say, I teach religious history, and I do a lot of stuff on sort of witch hunting and demonology and Puritans and Reformation and all of that stuff. And when Trump really started in 2016, I think it was, or maybe it was early 2017, when the beginning of the Mueller probe was unveiled, to tweet about being the victim of a witch hunt. The greatest witch hunt in American history, which, of course, all the historians of Salem kind of rolling their eyes so hard they fall back in their skull when he says that. So this rhetoric became incredibly prevalent, not just on the president's Twitter feed about being the victim of a witch hunt, but also in some people who were worried about the Me Too movement maybe going, quote unquote, too far and saying it's going to be a witch hunt against men and so forth. And so I really wanted to think about the way in which we were using that term, because there were actual historical witch hunts in the period that I study, to the tune of, over 100,000 people in Europe being accused, 80% of them women. There were the Salem witch hunts in the 1690s, which took the lives of 24 people, which a lot of people know about thanks to the Crucible. But I wanted to think about how the use of the term witch hunt by someone like Trump or by the defenders of Weinstein basically abused and subverted an actual history of a historical tragedy.
Well, this piece, by the way, is so well written. I've read it twice now. It's really important because it's not necessarily the history, which everything that you write and study and teach about is fascinating. And I'd love to know how you got into that field, that specific part of the history of religion. That alone is really interesting. But the idea here is that witch hunt, the people being hunted were overwhelmingly women, and the men using that phrase are Woody Allen and Harvey Weinstein and Donald Trump, who have overwhelmingly preyed upon women. I mean, that's what you're trying to correct here, is to say that the irony here and the victims or survivors of these men, these very powerful men and so many more crimes, are not the victim. How did I do? Yeah,
no, I mean, that's a huge part of it. Now, listen, there were people accused of witchcraft in, the 16th, 17th century. But women were the vast majority, around 75 to 85%, depending on which country you're talking about. And regardless, they were generally people who lacked political, social, economic power, which, of course, political, economic, and social power are things that the president, Weinstein, and others have in spades. So there's this profound irony of these men claiming to be victims of witch hunts, when historically, of course, witch hunting was not a tool against the powerless, but the powerless tended to be, or the people with less power tended to be, the victims. I think actually an even more important point that I'd really like to make here is witchcraft in the early modern period, the period that I study, was an imagined crime. Right? People believed that these supposed witches were in league with Satan, going to, big cannibalistic orgies in some cases, doing all sorts of magic, flying to Sabbaths and so forth. These were imagined crimes. These were not happening, even if folks were occasionally dabbling in magic, and that's a very small percentage of those accused. They were not witches as defined by the people in positions of power and by the community at large. So it was an imagined crime. That could not be more different, as the verdict in the Weinstein case has proven, than what is going on in the case of these powerful men. They are guilty of actual crimes. And I think, no doubt, the impeachment investigation and hearing of Trump bore that out. I mean, even a number of Republicans admitted he had committed a crime. They just didn't think he should be removed. So that's really critical, because to call yourself a victim of the witch hunt is actually to try and make a statement about the crime at play and to say, I didn't do it, and this is a made-up thing. And of course, that's manifestly untrue.
It's such an important point. This is a really, I think, relevant article in the Washington Post that they published back in 2017, but certainly matters a lot now that Harvey Weinstein has been sentenced. What was your, we started this by having you read your reaction, these tweets that went viral to Elizabeth Warren not doing better in the Democratic primary, and how that feels to you. How does it feel to you to see a guy like Harvey Weinstein found guilty? The reactions yesterday when it happened were pretty interesting. What was yours?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm happy that some justice was done, but I think the critical phrase there is some justice, and that there are so many women who will never have justice, particularly women from the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, women of color, far less likely to have justice against those who have assaulted and harmed them in so many ways. So I felt really happy to see it happen. Obviously, this is the right outcome in the Weinstein case. However, this is only the beginning of trying to sort of rectify historical wrongs and to sort of change the climate where someone like Weinstein doesn't have a whole cadre of people covering for him, right? And frankly, so the justice is great, but Donald Trump has been accused by, I think almost 24 women of sexual, and so. And
admitted to things, and you've seen
absolutely.
Him do things. It's not like it's, Yeah,
and I actually think to that point, one thing that I did see some people saying on Twitter, and certainly that I feel, it's been, as a woman, and again, I say this from a position of privilege, even as a middle class white woman, it has been a hard couple of years between, seeing this misogynist, elected who brags openly about grabbing women, to see all of that, to go through the Brett Kavanaugh hearings and to watch that quite closely, and just with the sort of Me Too movement in the background, it has been tiring, and it's felt kind of cumulative. And I'll give you a very specific example. So I teach a lot of amazing young people. And one of the women in one of my classes came up to me after the hearings where Dr. Ford was testifying about her experiences.
And said, Christine Blasey Ford,
Yes, sorry. And said, between Hillary losing and Brett Kavanaugh still getting on the Supreme Court, even though, he's had these allegations against him, and even though he's shown himself not really to be of the proper character, it makes me feel, this is what she said, it makes me feel like even as a woman, if I do everything right, it doesn't matter. And that's a heartbreaking thing to hear a young, intelligent 19-year-old woman say. And I'm hoping that having these conversations will help us move past this problem and push against it.
Well, I'm so glad that you said that, because I was going to say something similar in terms of not quite that powerful, but just in terms of the fact that Trump, who's this horrible man, nominates Brett Kavanaugh, and despite what you'd think about what happened in his past, his judicial record is one that suggests that he is going to make things a lot harder for women. And it's like Trump wins, and whether or not you were one of his actual victims of his assaults, he is now putting these justices, not only Kavanaugh, a whole bunch of other men, upon all of us, specifically women and people of color, minimizing their opportunity and their rights. So it's even if he didn't assault you, now he has. Is how I see it in terms of the appointments that he's made.
No, so absolutely. And I don't know how much we should freak out yet about Roe and women's access to reproductive rights being under threat. But I think that's certainly in play. I mean, if Trump wins again, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is not going to live forever, even though I think we all wish that she would. And there will be, new judicial appointments to the courts. And even if Roe itself is not overturned, I mean, all of these states are making it incredibly difficult for women to have access to abortions. And certainly, I should say, this disproportionately affects sort of women of color in lower income communities or who live in rural areas further away from cities that might have like a state's last remaining, center where they can get an abortion. And I think, as a historian, I know for a fact that if you make abortion illegal, that's not going to stop people from attempting to control their own fertility choices, right? Women will, to their own danger, take matters into their own hands. And so, it really is a life and death question. And it's going to be women of color and lower income women who are disproportionately affected by this. And I'm frankly really, really concerned. You talk to women who were alive and during the fight for Roe, and it seems like a huge step backwards because they remember, backstreet alley abortions and so forth.
Yep.
So yes, we're right to be concerned and to feel that his Supreme Court choices affect us in really profound ways.
Well, let's wrap up our conversation by just tying it all together, because before I hit record, you mentioned that you have some interesting, obviously, thoughts and opinions on healthcare, having now lived in the UK a couple of times. And talking about women's reproductive rights and talking about the race for the White House. What are your thoughts in terms of the policies that have been proposed by Democrats in terms of the status quo in the United States based on what you've experienced in terms of the healthcare systems in the UK and elsewhere?
Yeah, I think it's such a great question that you ask, because I think, I've been lucky enough in my life to have opportunities to live abroad, basically through my job, through my research. So I've experienced healthcare systems that are really different than our own. And listen, I understand that what people are fearful of what they don't understand. That makes complete sense. If you've never lived in a country with socialized medicine, it seems like this huge leap. It is a big leap. I think we need to be honest about that. But personally, I'm in favor of Medicare for all, because in some ways it replicates some of the systems that they have in place in areas like, Scandinavia, the UK, Canada. Now, the system in the UK is not perfect. The NHS, the National Health Service, is underfunded actually, and has been increasingly underfunded by conservative governments. But it's still this brilliant resource. I've been to the emergency room twice when I've lived here. I've been seen really quickly, had amazing care. Every sort of good treatment from the people who work at NHS hospitals. When I talk to people who live here about the American health system, I'll tell them the story of my sister whose pregnancy cost $38,000 and she's going to be paying that off for ages, or other members of my family who've declared bankruptcy because of healthcare cost. And people in the UK can't even fathom that, because it doesn't matter in the UK if you are a dock worker, a university professor, or someone, in a really high-end job, you have access to care at the NHS, which means you're not going to go bankrupt because you break your leg or have a heart attack. And I think that's a humane system. It's not perfect, but at least it's humane. And don't we want to strive for that in our healthcare? Don't we want to take enough risks so that we can make sure we have a system that treats people with dignity and values their lives and doesn't cause them to suffer because of the fact that they're poor? I think it's a real model for us to look at how other parts of the world value human health and human flourishing compared to how we do.
We don't need to look at other parts of the world. This is America.
I know.
Dignity. What the hell is?
I know.
Yeah. Oh, so many great points. So great talking to you.
Yeah, thank you.
We can criticize, and we should, social media all day long, but without it, I wouldn't have discovered your work and had this opportunity to have such a great, I'm not going to say conversation, just this thoughtful questions that I got to ask, because you're the one giving these thoughtful answers. So Thank you so much, Mikki, for talking to me today. And I hope we can keep it going because I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you and reading about you and preparing to talk to you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity.
All right, we'll talk again soon. Follow her on Twitter at Mikki Brock, everybody.
Thanks.
There you go. How did you like Professor Mikki Brock? I really enjoyed our chat. I hope you did as well. Let's move this train right along. Third guest of episode 53 on Stand Up, national security analyst Clint Watts. Love Clint Watts. I don't really agree with, by the way, what he says about Bernie Sanders in terms of his, feelings towards or how he would deal with the Soviet Union. But I didn't want to tangle with him because I wanted to get to a whole bunch of other points, and we only had a few minutes. He was at a Starbucks in Manhattan, so the sound that you might hear a little bit is there, but I think it sounds pretty good, actually. Anyway, great conversation with Clint Watts, who had put out a post at FPRI, the Foreign Policy Research Institute, about the continuing interference that Russia is engaging in this current election. Here's my conversation with the great Clint Watts, who's on Twitter at Selected Wisdom. Follow him there. Tell him you heard him here on Stand Up, please. Hey, Clint Watts.
Hey, Pete Dominic, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much for joining me. Really urgent conversation I want to have with you about what is happening with Russian interference. Before we get started on the latest and your awesome and important post at Foreign Policy Research Institute, how do we know how effective Russian intervention was in the 2016 election? How do you measure their interference and how effective it was?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to think about it. There were 4 big narratives they were pushing. They're elevating Trump. They were against Clinton. They were pushing that Bernie Sanders got a raw deal from the DNC. And then, a very light sort of thing that you still got to show up for Jill Stein. And the only one that you can clearly attribute to Russia is Bernie Sanders got a raw deal from the DNC. That came strictly from them hacking the DNC, hacking Podesta's emails, doing those dumps. That really changed that whole narrative they owned in the U.S. space. In terms of the others, which is elevating Trump, denigrating Clinton, that is tougher to prove because where does the U.S. media ecosystem stop and, where does the Russian sort of disinformation system pick up? But you could see very clear amplification effects with Clinton, for example, her health, that she was part of this corrupt machine of the DNC. Those things really went out of the way. I think the other part was the pro-Trump stuff was very early, and really the pro-Trump stuff helped him vis-a-vis the other Republicans more than anything, in the primary time. This time of year, in 2016. And so I think the big places to look are like Michigan and Wisconsin, where you saw, down turnout for Clinton, up turnout for Sanders during the primary season, and then Trump sort of sneaking in a victory that people didn't anticipate. I think the longer-term stuff about Russia, where you see them having the most dramatic effect, and this is what they're really after, is a 20% shift in Republican support for Russia in 4 years. That is tremendous, from an influence perspective. Having people show up in the U.S. and say, Russia is our friend at rallies, which is not only odd, it's just something you never hear, but to see that, I think that's what you're really looking for in terms of effectiveness. And so they're getting a lot of traction.
And we know that they are back at it. We've got a lot of evidence of that. And in your post at FPRI, which everybody should check, you asked this important question, which I'm very confused about. Trump or Sanders, who does Russia want to be president? We heard that they are interfering on behalf of both of them or for both of them.
Right. So I think a way to think about it is it's a two-pronged calculus for Russia. They would probably be okay with either of those candidates. I mean, from their perspective right now, it looks pretty good. I mean, you have President Trump, who's openly said he wants to be friends with Putin. He's had meetings with Putin. We don't know what was said in those meetings. His actions seem to always try and mitigate anything we're doing against Russia. And he's not been staunch. He still doesn't accept that Russia, helped on his behalf in 2016. Then you look at Sanders on the other side. I mean, this is a guy who went to the Soviet Union, oftentimes talked very appreciative. I don't know if appreciative is the right word, but, very positively about the Soviet Union at a time where we were in the Cold War. And when you look at him just as a candidate, he doesn't even address foreign policy issues or national security, really. And his message is principally that the U.S. is at fault around the world for wars of choice and that we should withdraw back. And that's a message that Russia agrees with and can't wait to come to fruition. So just looking at it from their point of view, either works. If you promote Sanders, you're also pushing a populist sort of candidate against the establishment Democrats, and that's really the opponent of the Russians. That's Joe Biden. It seems to be Mike Bloomberg now. Those are the people they don't want in office. So it's a win-win from their perspective, and it's also two populist teams, Trump and Sanders, that are highly divisive inside America on both sides of their political spectrum. So from their perspective, they want chaos, and they can get it with either one of them. Two totally different versions of chaos, but they get the results either way.
How can we be on the defense against this, Clint? Because they are using social media to divide us, and we don't know who they are. They are hacking into accounts and potentially exposing what they find to divide us. And what else? Television? What are the different techniques and tactics that they are using? How can we be on the defense and recognize it? How can you possibly recognize it as an ordinary member of the public, citizen, voter?
Yeah, I think there's three parts to it, right? There's just the overt propaganda, which you can see in the open from their state-sponsored news outlets and from diplomats and things like that, and you can see that, and it's not particularly effective. Then there's the covert social media trolling, the troll farm kind of stuff. And while they did that very heavily in 2016 and have tried, I think, to build that capability, you've seen Facebook actually shut down lots of accounts, even going back into last year. And so I don't feel like it's going to be the same effect in social media that we saw 4 years ago. And that's what's curious about the Washington Post Russia supporting Bernie Sanders story is, does the government know about some sort of social media amplification that we don't know? What caused that assessment? I think the part that we should remember is in 2020, there's really only one thing Russia could do that America isn't already doing to itself, and that's hacking to power influence. So when you think the reports about Russia trying to hack Burisma, which is assumably to get dirt on Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, the Burisma dealings, and then release it into the public, that's something they can do that someone in the United States can't do. And so that's really, when you look at the ads this time, you got Trump, you got Bloomberg spending hundreds of millions on Facebook ads. It's hard for Russia to make any sort of a dent really in that. Last time they snuck up on everybody, no one in the States knew what was going on. They didn't understand what the hacks were about. This time we know. I think moving forward, the only thing Russia really can do to tip the balance is hack to power influence, and I'm not even sure that they would do that at this point. If it comes out Trump or Sanders, they would be wise to just kind of let it roll probably, because either outcome would be fine for them.
So what about the social media companies themselves? You answered that a little bit, but how are Facebook and Twitter and anybody else doing to police the Russian interference or other foreign countries or other hackers' interference this time around? Are they doing a good job, bad job, enough, not enough?
Yeah, I think across the board they're doing, 100 times more, if I could, put a number on it. They didn't really do anything last time. This time you're seeing them really pick up their efforts because they're worried about it. So for the most part, you're seeing Facebook do closures. You've seen Twitter do closures. Reddit did some. Google's done some. So that they're on top of it. I think where it gets really tough is the domestic stuff. I mean, in 2020, it is domestic disinfo, that will take the stage, and it is so much larger in scale and so pervasive that's really what will twist things one way or another, and that's an almost impossible challenge for social media companies to police.
All right, Clint, I've just got to ask you about this news that the president, his director of national intelligence, who oversees the other 17 intelligence agencies, gave a briefing to congressional leaders talking about Russian interference. And as a result, apparently, the president of the United States fired him, dismissed him unceremoniously. McGuire is his name. He replaced him with someone that people are referring to as a loyalist, his former ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell, who apparently does not have much intelligence experience, at the top of any organization, much less leading an organization, overseeing 17 others. What is your reaction to the president firing one DNI for this reason, by the way, and hiring Richard Grenell?
There's two parts to it that I think are striking. One, what do we want our intelligence community to do? We want them to provide objective, information and assessments to the White House and to Capitol Hill so our policymakers can make good decisions. That's what we pay billions of dollars for as taxpayers. And if they can't do that, then how are they supposed to do their jobs? And it's just interesting how, again, our political leaders, they could hear that assessment and not hyperventilate and start firing everyone, right? You could have a discussion about it. It just shows how messed up our political system is at this point, that we can't have honest discussion or honest debate. It's not ridiculous that the Russians would support Trump. They've done it before. We have the Burisma hack to talk about. You can read Russian state-sponsored news. They clearly like President Trump in 2020. So how do we navigate forward if our intel pros can't do that, and then they're replaced by people that are clearly really known to just be social media trolls? I mean, Grenell was known as a top social media troll, and you just have to think, if Grenell came out with an assessment about the election, would you believe anything he says? And it'd be very hard for me to trust the information coming from him.
Finally, I see that you're tweeting about the coronavirus. I think you said something about you're more worried about that than the outcome of the election. What is your concern about that, Clint?
It's twofold. I think people are probably underestimating the scale of this, particularly when it gets to developing countries and they start contracting it. It becomes really difficult to contain. China was slow to respond because of their censorship, but at least they can do control measures that other countries can't do. Once it starts spreading, it's going to be really hard to put back in the bottle. And so I think impacts to the market, that leads to unemployment, that leads to decreased spending, that leads to instability. Some of these areas, like in Italy, which is shutting down right now, it can be absolutely devastating in some of these smaller towns. So I just see this as a much, much bigger thing that either candidate, when they come to office, and I'm not sure I would really trust that the U.S. government under Trump's leadership can really handle, an outbreak like this.
Right.
Either candidate would have a really tough time trying to get the country back up off the ground.
All right. Thank you for your time, Clint, and thank everybody at the Starbucks for keeping it down there. That was not too bad at all. I appreciate it.
Well, I will. Thanks, Pete.
All right. There you go. That is my third guest, Clint Watts. Follow him on Twitter at Selected Wisdom. Watch his TED Talk. Get his book, Messing with the Enemy, and let him know you heard him here. It's a big deal. Come on. I say that every time. Are you letting them know? Are you tweeting him? Please tweet him at Selected Wisdom. Say, I heard you on the Stand Up Podcast. Thank you for joining, Pete. Always appreciate that. Okay, now I've got my final guest joining me. His name is Roger McNamee. He was an early investor in Facebook, and he was friends with Mark Zuckerberg and helped out a lot with the launch, I guess, of Facebook. And he's now written an anti-Facebook manifesto, if you will. His book is called Zucked. And here's my conversation with Roger McNamee right now.
It is a great honor. Thanks for including me.
Absolutely. I love your book. I loved you at an Intelligence Squared debate. I feel like it was at Aspen.
It was at Aspen, and that was an amazing experience. Oh my God.
It was one of the rare ones where I had my mind changed. It was about social media and democracy.
Thank
and
you.
I'm recording for the record.
That's fine. Go ahead. It was an extraordinary experience because it requires a lot of preparation to do a formal debate. I'd only done one other in my entire life. It's not a natural thing. And it was fun to do the preparation, but also intimidating to do it at Aspen. Aspen Ideas.
Can I just ask you just about that motion and where maybe you can talk about it today in terms of social media's role for a healthy democracy or to create what we're seeing a lot of now, which is authoritarianism and autocracies in the world?
So it should be possible for social media to promote democracy. Unfortunately, the nature of the products, because they are global in scale, they naturally want to align with the powerful over the powerless. And the result has been to tip things very decidedly in favor of authoritarians. And it doesn't have to be that way. And a big part of what I'm trying to do is to help the people who work at these companies appreciate that they can be part of the solution, not part of the problem.
So take me back to 2016, and can you give me, a succinct answer on what happened in terms of social media's role, specifically, obviously, Facebook had a huge role in the election, how it was used and how it affected the outcome?
Yeah, so Pete, the thing that really bothered me is I had at that point been involved with Facebook since 2006, so for a decade, and I'd been a huge fan. And all of a sudden, early 2016, I began to see things going on in the Democratic primary in the United States and New Hampshire, so exactly 4 years ago. And then also in the United Kingdom in the Brexit referendum that made me realize, oh my gosh, the same advertising tools that make Facebook so valuable to both users and advertisers can be used to undermine democracy. And I think there was a very, very sophisticated campaign run by the Trump for president team that exploited what Facebook does incredibly well, which is to allow targeting of individuals with any message you want. And they used it in a very effective way to suppress votes of people who were unlikely to vote for President Trump, but who might have voted for a Democrat. And they got them not to vote at all. And in the end, that had a decisive impact on the outcome of the election. Now, there's no laws against that. But I would think if you were Facebook or Google or any other internet platform, you wouldn't want to be a tool that was used to distort the outcome of elections because only one side was using it.
Well, it's not only distorting the outcome of elections, and I know you've talked about this, but it also creates a place for people to be misinformed, whether it be anti-vaccination, climate change, or not necessarily misinformed, but it allows for a place where white supremacists can gather. Sure, I can get together with all of my friends who are into My Little Pony on a Facebook page, and that's fine and that's harmless. Well, unless I care about my reputation and all, but it also allows for hate groups to congregate. What about anti-vaccination and climate change denialism and white supremacists, and what Facebook and other social media allows for that? You wrote about that in Zucked.
And so, Pete, you get right to the heart of the problem. The business model is based on monopolizing our attention. They're competing against television, radio. They're competing against podcasts, movies, video games, all these other media. In order to do that, they need to command our attention, but they have an advantage. They have the ability, because of the way smartphones work, to target us individually. And so they appeal to the parts of human psychology we can't avoid. And the stuff that does that best is stuff that makes us either afraid or stuff that makes us outraged, which is to say hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. And so the algorithms, in trying to grab our attention, naturally promote that really noxious content over and over again, which is how you get that awful situation we saw last week with the 4-year-old in Colorado who, contracted the flu, and the doctor prescribed Tamiflu. The mother went on to an anti-vax group on Facebook, 179,000 members. Yikes. They said put a potato in a sock, all kinds of herbal things, and the poor child died. And that kind of stuff is really widespread. And as you say, climate change denial, gun violence, white supremacy, all of these things are made more powerful because inside Facebook, inside Instagram, inside YouTube, the most angry content gets amplified, and that winds up crowding out all the good stuff.
What is surveillance capitalism, and how do we defend ourselves from it, Roger?
So, Pete, think of it as the new economic model of capitalism, that for the last 100 years, the economy was dominated by oil, right? That was the basic building block for the whole system. Google, 20 years ago, realized that they might be able to cause the economy to shift towards valuing data as the most important commodity. And so surveillance capitalism is really the data economy. And the notion is that wherever we go in the economy, we leave a little digital signature. And if you collect all that data from every credit card transaction, every time you travel, every time you get a medical test or a prescription, every time you go on the web or use an app, every time you use email, if you collect all that information, you can create a data voodoo doll of each and every American. And from that, you can make predictions about what people are going to do. And for Google and Facebook, who control the most important search engines, news feeds in our lives, they can use that data voodoo doll to manipulate our behavior. And my job as an activist and as somebody who was involved in Silicon Valley for 34 years is to tell people what I know and give them a chance to decide for themselves what.
Well, what can we do? I mean, give me some solutions. What can each one of us do individually or as communities? And by the way, maybe even using social media to get it done.
Exactly. So, Pete, you're right on this. So relative to privacy, we have no rights today. So politically, we have to insist to politicians that we get right. But in the short run, recognize that Apple, which makes the iPhone, has chosen privacy as essentially the unifying piece around which they build iPhones. So relative to all other phones, Apple has huge advantages on privacy. So next time you get a phone, if you switch to Apple, you will find that your privacy is much better protected. That's a super important thing to do. Another thing to do is protect your children. We are now realized that children are being preyed upon. And whether it's social media, whether it's video games, whether it's Chromebooks in classrooms, they're collecting data and kids have no protection. So we want to essentially delay exposing our kids to technology as long as possible. We want to give them better role models. We want to be there with them to protect them as they're going forward. That's super important. But at the end of the day, this is really going to come down to insisting to our elected representatives that they create both privacy protections, but also protections for democracy and the economy to prevent internet platforms from distorting everything. And at the end of the day, bringing our voices to bear in politics is going to be the most successful way to bring about change because politicians are ready to hear it. They just need to hear more voices pushing behind them.
I like you, and I like your book, and I followed your story, and I know that you're also an artist, a musician, as well as a businessman and an investor. And at the end of our conversation here, I want to ask you a personal question. You don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but I've gone through a career transition recently at the age of 44. It's scary. Financial security is a really, really important thing. Healthcare is a really important thing. I look at Roger McNamee and say, that guy's probably worth $1 billion. My question to you is, given the fact that you have a young child and you have a great career, what problems do you have? Is there anything that you can share with the rest of us, especially men, about that's been difficult for you to overcome, any kind of transition and how you did it?
So, Pete, two things. First of all, I mostly worked for a salary for much of my career, so I didn't make anything like as much money as you think. But I did very well, and I don't want to pretend that I wasn't successful, but nothing like what you suggested there. And yes, I've had multiple traumatic healthcare crises in my life that required me to start all over again. One of my businesses was taken away from me when I had strokes and then open heart surgery to repair a birth defect. And so I've gone through that exact experience. And the advice I try to give people is remember this. Life will always give you downs. The important thing is as long as you have an up following every down, you're going to be okay. And at the end of the day, part of why we need to get involved politically right now is our economy does not work for everybody, right? And we have to use our political voices, and we have to be smarter and recognize that our competition is not the people who are like us or people who look different but are at a similar economic level. But it's the fact that the economy is really skewed right now to favor a very small number of people who look like what you thought I looked like, okay? And my job is to say to people, hang on. Right now, things aren't balanced. They aren't fair. The economy, it's not really capitalism we have today. And we need to get back to a fair capitalism, which requires the government to set the rules and to enforce them fairly for everybody. We can get back there, but we got to work at it.
Let's argue about capitalism, and let's talk more about your personal struggles. I think that's fascinating what you just said. I'd love to get more into all of that with you in the future. Roger, as always, thank you very much for your time. I love talking to you. Thanks, man.
I look forward to coming back on the show, Pete. It'll be great.
Let's talk soon. Thanks, Roger. Okay, that's it. Thank you to all of my guests, starting with Dr. Meghan May, as well as Professor Mikki Brock, national security expert Clint Watts, and just now Roger McNamee. Thank you for your support on patreon.com. Couldn't do it without it. There, so many new people signing up. Really appreciate it. Check the link in the show notes for all the information about all my guests. Support them and follow them on Twitter and tell them that you heard them here. And help me out with my daughter. She's got scoliosis. She's 15 years old, and it's scary. It's going to be a lot of adversity, and there's a lot of people out there that have had it or know somebody who has scoliosis, so I'm asking for your help on that. If you need my help on something, you should ask me as well. I'd be happy to do whatever I can for you. And if you've got ideas for the bonuses for the Patreon members, let me know there as well. And I will talk to you on Friday right here on Stand Up. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.